Lynn and Kevin and Otto asked me to talk about silvopasture economics and implementation. And so I'm going to start with a disclaimer, which is that I am so not an economist. And I think in some ways it doesn't matter a huge amount for what I'm going to tell you, because I think even an economist would tell you the answer to a lot of the details is we don't know yet and it depends. So I'm going to try and go through that and kind of open up your minds to some of the things you might want to think about if you're considering silvopasture. So just really briefly, a quick definition. What do we mean by silvopasture? We mean a system where you're producing forages, you're raising livestock, and you have trees and you're managing for trees on the same site at the same time. Typically, what people say is that trees provide long-term returns and the livestock provides annual income. And that's true, but then there's a lot of variation in there in terms of what kinds of returns you can expect from the trees. And we'll try and touch on that. So here are some of the considerations that I'm going to try to cover. Number one is the establishment cost. Or in some cases, you might be able to get income during the establishment phase, but that's not necessarily a given. There are tax implications, and they can go both ways again, depending on what your situation is. There can be forage and shade value, but that's again going to vary by site and by management. Income from trees, and that's highly variable, again by your site, by your goals, by your management. And then throughout it, there's going to be implications in terms of how much labor and other costs. And so the labor and other costs, that's woven throughout. There's not a separate section in the presentation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit just about some ideas in terms of implementation. All right. So first of all, when you're thinking about establishment, there's two very different ways to go at silvopasture. You can have an existing woodland, and you can establish your silvopasture in that. And that's going to be a very different path, and it's going to have some very different economic considerations from the other one, which is if you have either open crop ground or an existing pasture, and you're planting trees in that. So I'm going to go through those a little bit one at a time. I'm going to start with the forest to silvopasture establishment, just because in my experience, most people who are interested in starting in silvopasture are in that situation, but the planting is also really important. So the advantages of going from forest to silvopasture is, number one is it's faster. You already have the trees. Number two, in some cases you can make money from it, and I'll talk a little more about that. And if you're looking at timber as one of your goals, your tree form, which is how straight your tree is, and how much of that trunk doesn't have branches, which cause knots, is going to be better for trees that grew up in a closed, like in a competitive environment with a lot of trees around them. So if you're going for timber, you're starting out in a better position if you're thinning an existing forest. But there's some disadvantages. You don't get to choose what species are there. You have what you have. And you have risk of damage. So in several different forms. One is that anytime you do logging, you can have damage from the logging. And then also, once you've thinned a stand, you have higher risk of damage from wind throw. And so that's another thing to consider. And also, then you have stumps there. And so that is going to complicate your labor and your management in your silvopasture. So, can you get income from the thinning? And it depends enormously, and I would say it depends on these three factors. First and foremost, on your local market. And my understanding is up here, you're actually in a relatively fortunate position in terms of market compared to where I do my research, which is down the southwestern part of the state. In that part of the state, there's a market for veneer quality timber, saw timber, but there's no secondary markets for anything other than that. So if you're thinning before you have logs that are in good enough shape and big enough to be used as saw timber, there's no existing market for that. Up here you have something of a paper market, and you probably even have more of a demand for some of those other lower cost markets like firewood. Your stand size and the access to the stand are going to be really important too. If you're dealing with 10 acres, it's going to be a little harder to get a logger interested than if you're dealing with 100 acres of woodland. Access is super important. How easy is it for them to get there? And obviously the quality of the stand is going to matter a lot. In a lot of cases, the quality of stand is going to be something that was grazed in the past and was just left to grow up and was maybe what we call high graded, so it was logged maybe a couple times, where the logger came in and took out the best quality. Well, think about the genetics of that. You take out your best quality trees, you leave behind the ones that aren't very good, and 40 or 50 years later, that doesn't make for a better stand. One thing I really want to say is if you're going to establish silvopasture from an existing stand, it's really worthwhile to consult with a forester first. Number one, we talked about the risk of damage, both from logging, and then one of the things I didn't mention is one of the things that foresters definitely worry about, and it is something to think about, is that livestock can be hard on trees. For sure hard on young trees if you're trying to get, if you have a stand and you're trying to get regeneration, anything that's less than 2-3 inches in diameter and where the canopy of the saplings isn't kind of above head height, of course cattle are going to rub on those, they can walk on them. But even with larger trees, depending on the situation, they can rub a lot, depending on how you're doing your management. And there's concerns about livestock damage. So one thing is, if you have a stand, you kind of want a forester to come in and take a look and tell you the value of what you have. They might tell you, from a forestry perspective, there's nothing here to worry about. And in that case, you kind of know, okay, if some trees get damaged from livestock, those weren't trees that were worth thousands of dollars that you're losing their value. On the other hand, if they come in and they tell you this stand has a very high forestry value, you might want to think twice about how you're going to implement silvopasture on that stand, because you could get a little bit of extra income from having the cattle in there, but you could lose a lot of forestry value. You can get a forester to come and walk your stand for free if you have more than 10 acres, so you can get a free visit from a forester. And I would, again, strongly encourage you to do that. Any questions before I move on to planting establishment? All right, so there are some advantages about planting. Number one, you get to pick the species. You get to pick where you plant those trees, and you can apply for financial assistance for it, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Disadvantages are obviously time. You have to wait until those trees can give you the things you want from them, until you get any income from them or any of the other values you're looking for. And there is more upfront labor for you, and there's initial cost. And then, as I mentioned, if timber is your goal, then getting a good quality tree form when you plant silvopasture is going to be a challenge. And there's a couple things you can do that I will talk about, but you're probably, it's going to be hard in a silvopasture setting to get the same level of trees for timber quality that you would in a full forest. And also why I mentioned why rows. Well, rows just makes life easier in terms of bringing equipment in terms of running your fence and everything. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So establishment costs, you have to pay for the trees, you have to do site preparation. Tree protection is really important. You all may know if you plant trees and you don't protect them both from any livestock you may have grazing on the site, but even if you're going to keep livestock off that site initially, you still have to protect the trees from deer, from rodents. So if you don't protect your trees, you're probably going to lose your investment. Weed control is also really important. If you don't do weed control, again, your trees are going to take a really long time to grow if they don't die due to weed competition. Irrigation may or may not be necessary, but it's something to be prepared for. So depends on the year when you do your planting. But again, you could lose all your site preparation and investment in planting if you don't have a plan for irrigation if it's dry after you plant them. So NRCS does have programs to help with tree planting in an open pasture situation. Basically I would say, and they have a whole bunch of different practices that you can apply. So there's the site preparation, something called tree and shrub establishment, separate practice. These are all separate practices you can apply for, so you can stack them on each other. So I would say go and talk to your local office. One of the things is, I think it's a rolling application. The deadline for this year was November 16th, so theoretically you could get an application in before then, but when I talked to the NRCS person, they said actually in some ways it would be advantageous to get an application in if it's something you're considering soon after, because it's kind of on a first come first served basis. So if you get an application in early in the cycle, you're more likely to be funded than if you do late. All of these things, of course, depend on the Farm Bill continuing to be reauthorized as we think it is. But, I mean, I guess it has been for many years, and so I'm assuming that these practices will continue. Before I move on to tax considerations, any questions about the establishment and the economic, the sort of cost questions there? I'm kind of ignoring my notes, so I'm sure I've forgotten to say a lot of things. So in terms of tax considerations, Wisconsin has basically, I think, 4 different tax categories that apply when we're thinking about silvopasture. And you're probably even more familiar with these than I am, but I'm just going to go through them quickly. So productive or recreational forest is taxed basically at the highest sale value that you could get for that land. There's no like use value tax breaks for that. If your forest adjoins agricultural land that is in use, then you pay tax at a half of what that basic tax rate would be. So you do get a tax break for agricultural forest that adjoins working agricultural lands. But then there are 2 other tax programs that are specifically apply to forested land on farms, or forested land in general. The managed forest law, and you're probably all familiar with that, is something where you work with DNR, you develop a plan, and you basically enter into a contract with DNR, and that reduces your property taxes, but you have to follow that contract, and that's typically for 25 or 30 years. And if you enter into an MFL agreement, one of the things is you are not allowed to do any grazing on that land. So if you're in an MFL situation, you are already getting a tax break, but great, silvopasture is out of the question unless you're willing to pay all the back taxes that you didn't pay while you had that MFL going, or unless you wait for the contract to expire. And so I know examples of both, of people who've decided that they really wanted to do silvopasture and they were willing to work with DNR and say, I'm pulling my land out of MFL. And I know of cases of, or at least one case of someone who waited for that 25-year MFL contract to end and then instituted silvopasture. But then finally, wooded pasture is the lowest tax rate in Wisconsin property tax law. So if you implement silvopasture, there is a chance that that forest land could switch from, in most cases, probably agricultural forest to wooded pasture. And typically that tax rate is about 10 to 20% of what the full tax rate would be. So it would be an additional savings beyond agricultural forest land. And that is a significant attraction for a bunch of people. But one thing is how agricultural or how grazed forest is interpreted. This is the sort of language in the Wisconsin tax law, and there's some kind of problematic sections in it. And the first one is active grazing keeps the undergrowth in check. That one's kind of neutral. What exactly does that mean? It does mean you have to be actively grazing, but what does keeps the undergrowth in check mean? That's something that is kind of a subjective interpretation, and we want to make sure it doesn't mean that they require it to be that it looks like a wasteland under those trees. The one that I think is highly problematic is the stuff I've outlined in red, which is that the land should be pastured daily or on a reasonably periodic basis. I don't have any trouble with a reasonably periodic basis, but in silvopasture, it's super important to really do that adaptive management, to do rotational grazing. Those wood soils and those forages in shade are just a little bit more vulnerable than open pastures. And so all the good grazing practices that you folks talk about all the time are even more important, and quick rotational grazing is even more important in a silvopasture setting. So the pastured on a daily basis may be something you have to talk with your assessor about to make sure they understand that pastured on a rotational basis is really important. And then on the bottom it says land with non-existent or severely limited growth is not considered pasture, and that I think is good, because one of the things that we emphasize when we talk about silvopasture is that just having cows in the woods, if there's no forage there, that's not silvopasture. If you're not managing for a forage layer, then you're just turning cows in the woods, which might provide shade, but it has concerns in terms of impacts on the soil and concerns in terms of the nutrition of the cattle. It's not something that's not what we consider silvopasture. So I guess the only other thing I would add is that we think about anybody who works with taxes, and we kind of think in our head about we don't want to interact with them, we don't want to talk to them, but they're human beings, and they really are. I went to a meeting of the tax assessors just kind of to hear how they talk about it, and it's a challenge for them, right? They have to figure out the tax assessment on just a huge amount of land that they don't have time to visit. But if you contact them and say, this is what I'm doing, this is why I think this land should be changed in its assessment, and you work with them, I think in most cases they'll appreciate that. And that will help them come up with a better assessment than if they're just looking at an aerial photo and trying to make a determination. And it's their job to make a determination that will maximize the income for the area they're working in, unless they have information that tells them otherwise. So again, I would encourage you, just like I encourage you to talk to a forester, I would encourage you to talk to your tax assessor about the tax implications. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the forage value of silvopasture. And one thing I would say for sure is that you're going to have more forage. You're going to have more forage value if you're managing land for silvopasture than if you're not. And this is an example of someone who had this managed forest law stand, and then the 25-year period expired, and then he went in and he thinned it, took out 2/3 of the trees, and planted some forages, and you can see the unthinned stand, and then the forages growing in the thinned area. And obviously there's more forage. The flip side of that is you're going to, in almost all cases, not in all cases, but in almost all cases, you're going to have less forage production than on open pasture. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is just, in general, stuff doesn't grow as well in the shade. That depends a little bit on how much shade you still have. If you thin for the right amount for silvopasture and you're thinning to at least below 50% canopy coverage, you're probably not going to be impeding your growth too much. But over time, that canopy will fill in. So there's a real consideration, and I'll go into that later a little more, about pros and cons of thinning heavily versus not thinning heavily. But if you don't thin quite heavily, you are going to reduce the amount of forage. The other reasons you're going to have less forage is simply because you have trees there taking up some space, and also after you initially go in and thin, you're going to have slash to deal with, and that's going to take up some space too. So all of those things mean you're going to have less forage than if you didn't have trees there at all. However, you can have some real benefits, one of which is that the timing can really, in some cases, complement forage growth in open pasture. If you have a really hot, dry spell, forage in these sort of lightly shaded areas, research has shown will tend to keep growing better than forage out in the open, simply because it's not having to use up so much water, it's not having to transpire so much water as stuff out in the open. It's a little cooler under there, it's a little more humid under there with a little bit of a tree canopy, and so your forage will keep growing a little longer in that summer slump period where you might have a challenge in your open pastures. Another thing about forage value that people talk about, and there's not really any research that I know about this, so this is just kind of something that farmers have mentioned, is that you can have some different forages in there, and you also have some diversity of the things that happen to be in, this is particularly when you're thinning existing woodland, different species in there that your livestock can utilize where they might be able to be getting sort of some micronutrients or some other things that might benefit them. Again, I don't really know about specific research on silvopasture, so that's a little bit of a mixed bag, but it is something that people talk about. And then there's issues about forage quality. So there's some stuff in the research that says forage quality is better in silvopasture settings. In my own research, that's not what I have found, but what I found is that it's pretty close in quality to open pasture. I've also found, interestingly, that it's pretty close in quality to unmanaged forage, but I'll have some cautions about that. So unmanaged forage in my own research site, I'm comparing open pasture to silvopasture where the site's been thinned and we've planted a forage layer underneath, and to what we call grazed woods, which is where the site's been thinned, but we haven't actually planted a forage layer. So the cattle are just eating what has come up in that area without special management. And just basically the takeaway from here, and I know it's kind of too small for you to see, but so the blue is open pasture, the red is silvopasture, and the green is grazed woods. And the takeaway is basically on all these things, the quality difference is pretty minor. Sometimes it's statistically significant, but it's not significant from a beef nutrition point of view. And that the variation between times of year is larger than the variation between different treatments. But so here's one, the slide on the right is from the silvopasture plots, and the slide on the left is from the grazed wood slot. So here's one caveat I would make. When I did the forage sampling, I did not sample things that I knew the livestock wouldn't eat. So I didn't sample the plants that I knew to be toxic or the plants that I did not observe the livestock eating. So that forage quality analysis for the grazed woods is based on a subsample, based on sort of my knowledge. On the left, what you see in my grazed woods area is that a lot of my plots are getting a sort of an increasing amount of plants that have some sort of negative value. In this case on the left, it's a mayapple, which is toxic. I also have white snakeroot in my site, and I also have pokeweed. All of those things are things you don't want your livestock eating, and so it's really important to make sure if you have a silvopasture situation that you have enough good forage for them, and there's a couple ways you can do it. One is if you plant these forages, they keep the other things in check. So I've done, in my silvopasture sites, what I've done is I broadcast the forage plants, and in 3 of my 4 replications, that came in well, In the fourth one, I had to really go in and do a little bit of removal of some very aggressive garlic mustard we had, and then replant. But so having that grass there then has kept those other toxic species and those other species in check from spreading. But it does need continued management. This year, for the first time, I tried to not go in and do a little overseeding of the bare patches in the silvopasture, and I'm starting to see more of those other species come in there. But it still looks very different from those grazed wood sites where we have a lot more of those toxic species. In my area, having those toxic species present has not been a problem because the cattle in my site move in and out of the silvopasture to open pasture. So even on the grazed woods treatment, they have lots of access to a lot of good quality forage in the open pasture. So they're going there, they're nibbling on the stuff they like, and they're ignoring the stuff they don't like. But if you have some of those species present, you really do have to be cognizant about making sure you have a lot of good quality forage also available. So another thing that there's a lot of discussion about is the shade value. And the shade is definitely one of the things I've looked at in my site is just heat stress scores on the cows who are not allowed to go into the shade versus the ones who are. And whether the cows choose, as I say, they can move back and forth between open pasture and the shaded area. And they definitely choose to take advantage of the shaded area. They like going in there. So from an animal welfare perspective, shade is definitely of value. There's also a lot of research showing shade is of a lot of economic value, but all of that research is in areas that are a lot hotter than Wisconsin. And so in my site, I see no economic benefits, but I will also say there's a big caveat, which is in my site, the available silvopasture is so small that I can only have the cows on those plots for about 6 to 8 days over the course of the summer. So the fact that I don't see any economic benefits could also be simply because they're not on my plots for a long enough time. This is taken from some research done in Missouri, where a farmer set up silvopasture and on a 84 head cow-calf operation, and what they were looking for was improved weight gain in the summer and increasing the amount of grass acreage they had without purchasing additional land, which I know from talking to farmers in Wisconsin is often a consideration for silvopasture. It's a way you've got people have wooded area on their farm, and they're not currently getting income from it, and they think, well, we can get some forages on there and get some value out of there for a livestock operation. And they found, in fact, that the shade value really increased weight gain. So their average daily weight gain with the shade was 1.6 to 2.1 pounds per day, and without the shade, it was 0 to negative weight gain between June 15th and August 15th. And so they did this economic analysis, and they said it cost them about $1,200 per acre to thin out those silvopasture edges and plant the forages underneath them. And so they had a very good benefit-cost ratio of $3 to $4, or 3 to 4 times. But as I said, I have not seen that on my site, and so I would say Missouri's a lot hotter, and I can't say whether you would see that economic benefit of the shade up here. So the last sort of economic consideration I want to talk about is what income you can get from the trees, and there's lots of different sort of sources you could go look at. You could look at it, firewood for income, fruit or nuts for income, timber, fence posts or other products, and emergency fodder. And you know, in the first slide, when it talked about silvopasture being a way to get annual income from livestock and long-term income from trees, the first thing that sort of pops into everybody's mind is timber income from the trees. I would say about timber income is it's wonderful, but it does take a really long time, and timber markets are very variable. It depends on what you have. And so I would say don't think only about timber as an income source. And so a lot of people, for them, they've looked at some of these other things. But for all of them, it all depends on what your local market is, what the infrastructure is, and all of these are kind of new ideas. And so there are a lot of questions about all of them. And I think, so I want to back up a bit. In your folders, you should have a little handout that's called Economic Budgeting for Agroforestry Practices. And so if you want to pull that out, this is the same economist in Missouri who put together sort of a case study of what you might expect from planting silvopasture. And it's kind of a way to think about sort of one example about what this might look like. And he has some really good introductory discussion about what some of the things you need, what some of the costs are that you need to think about, and how to think about planning for it. But if you turn to Appendix C, again, this is kind of a list of some of the costs and some of the revenues that you could think about. And so that's a really good checklist. And then further on, there's a cash flow plan. I think that's page 6. So if you want to turn to page 6. And so what he's looking at here, it's not exactly silvopasture, but it's a system that's really close to silvopasture. So he's looking at planting eastern black walnut, which happily is a tree that will also grow in Wisconsin. And walnut is attractive for silvopasture for a number of reasons. It has casts a sort of a light shade, which is good for forage growth underneath it. Something like a maple tree, for example, casts a very heavy shade. And so that's going to cast maybe too much shade for the grasses growing underneath. And maple also tend to be shallow rooted, which means they're more susceptible to being damaged by livestock pressure. So black walnut has a good quality shade, tends to have a little more tolerance of a little bit of livestock pressure. And it is both a tree that can provide fruits or nuts, and it has high timber value. So that's probably why they chose it. And so in this case, they're doing what they call alley cropping. So they're actually talking about taking hay off in between rather than grazing in between. If you're establishing silvopasture, you could start out by either fencing those newly planted trees away from livestock, or you could, for the first few years, treat that as hayland, and then when the trees get big enough, turn it into actually silvopasture and grazing land. But you can see that year one, they have, so in the initial years, looking at, they say, variable costs. Oh, I see. They're getting some kind of revenue from the tree, and I'm not sure why they're getting $62 of revenue, but their costs for planting and caring for that tree is $650. So you can see that in that initial year, there was a lot of cost for establishing the tree, and so the net present value of the first year is negative. And so you can see that sort of in the initial years, you do have high costs, and it's not until year 11 that the income from both the trees and the hay in between the trees, and I'm not sure why the hay is not generating income. Oh, thank you. Yeah, okay. So that's a CRP payment, the $62 is probably a CRP payment. And so then, yes, after that CRP contract expires, then they can start taking income off that land. And then it stays pretty steady, but they have the income from the hay, and then they're giving themselves income from the nuts from the black walnut. And that's a pretty nice looking figure per acre, but that depends totally on having a market to sell that to. And then in Missouri, they are figuring that after 60 years, they can then harvest those black walnuts. And I just encourage you, mainly the reason that I sort of wanted you to look at this is to realize that figuring out these economic, the costs and balancing the costs is pretty complex, and there's a lot of considerations that go into generating each of these numbers. And we know a lot less about, the markets for these things are a lot less certain and a lot less established. I mean, it's hard enough to know how much you're going to sell sort of really established crops for, like corn and beans, but you do know a range, you do know that that infrastructure is there. And with some of these agroforestry crops, it relies a lot more on your own creativity in finding markets and finding ways to get those products to market. Any questions? Oh, okay, all right.
And I do have a question. Emergency fodder.
Oh, yes, so.
Do we have any trees in Wisconsin that are useful in this for emergency fodder?
There's a lot of trees that livestock would eat the foliage from. You could use, one of the trees that people sometimes use for this would be black locust, box elder, which everyone loves to hate. Actually, the leaves from that would be fine. And so you can even cut a tree down and let, in an extreme emergency situation, and let your livestock graze that. Of course, then you lose that tree. But if it's a low value tree like a box elder, you haven't really lost very much. So it is something that people can use in extreme situations.
I heard of some people cutting oak trees down in the 30s. When we had really bad drought in Wisconsin, the cows would actually eat oak leaves. I have never heard of that since.
Yeah.
The other one is Scottish Highlanders will eat just about anything. So, these kinds of trees may be alternate fodder for Scottish Highlanders.
Right, yeah. Yes, and shrubs are things too. In my site, for instance, I've seen sometimes they will browse on honeysuckle, and sometimes they won't. It's just kind of, I haven't figured out what determines when they will and when they won't, but it's variable.
What about suppressing invasive species like buckthorn or barberry? Have you seen advantages?
Yeah, again, the research there is mixed. So I think it depends a lot on the detail of management. And then you also run into things that you need to worry about. So some of these things they're not going to eat until they're desperate. And if you get them to the point where they're desperate, you worry that they might eat something that they shouldn't. And one caveat with sort of the emergency fodder thing is most trees, even oak trees, they would eat the leaves. But you don't want to do this with a black cherry tree or any kind of cherry tree, because those, as they wilt, can be toxic. So people have used livestock to manage brush, but I think you have to then very carefully think, if you only have livestock in there a little bit, they might actually encourage brush. So you have to have pretty heavy pressure, but then you do have to move the livestock very regularly to avoid a situation where they're tempted to eat things they shouldn't, if that makes sense. I just want to say, I know I only have about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I want to fly through here really quickly. On Silvopasture implementation, there's just a lot of different directions you can go on, and you really have to think carefully about what your site is, what your goals are for the Silvopasture. And what your assets are, what your time frame is. All of those things are going to have a strong influence. So here, really quickly, are examples of all these different kinds of goals, and I've kind of alluded to them already. But whichever one you prioritize is going to affect your silvopasture design. And you can't equally meet all of these goals on the same site. So there are trade-offs, more shade will be less forage production. Fruit or nuts, you'll want your tree to be more open grown, but that would be poor for timber. So you know, you have to prioritize and then manage for those, and then sort of have secondary goals that you might want to fit in to the extent that they can. If you plant, so there's lots of considerations. But I'll quickly say, you know, one of the decisions you have to make is, do you do a single row of trees, do you do a double row of trees, or do you do a triple row of trees? Single row of trees is, you know, fewer trees to plant, so you're taking up less of your pasture space. So if shade is your only goal, single row of trees makes a lot of sense. The spacing between the trees, you probably want to think about your machinery access in terms of how wide your alleys are between the trees. If you're interested in timber production, you probably want to look at a triple row of trees, because then at least your center row is going to have good form, and your other rows are not. And then your spacing within the row is going to depend on how much management you want to do. You know, if you space them really close together, you're going to have a better chance of high, you know, survival of, you know, a fair number of trees. But you're going to have to go in and thin and manage them sooner than if you space them further apart. The form will be better if you space them close together, but again, you're going to have to go in and thin sooner. Very quickly, I would say silvopasture is part of a system. I would never advocate silvopasture as being your whole system. You definitely also want to have open pasture, and not every woodland site is suitable for silvopasture. You might have a tax agreement, as I mentioned, that you don't want to break. Some sites are too steep. Some soils are too vulnerable, either because they're too wet or just because they're fragile soils. If you have a site that has high timber quality, I would say don't mess with silvopasture. You can lose more than you might gain. Or if you are trying to do regeneration, natural regeneration on your site, again, you could lose more value than you gain. So lots of different design options. One thing you want to think about is, do you want your paddock to be all silvopasture, or do you want it to be part silvopasture and part open pasture where the cattle can move in and out of the shade? If the full paddock is going to be silvopasture, you're going to have to thin it more to make sure you have enough forage growth. If it's going to be a mix of the two, you can get away with having maybe a little more shade in the wooded area, because there's going to be supplementary forage there, but that's not going to probably be the primary forage source for the animals on that paddock. One of the things people often talk about is crop tree selection. That's assuming you have trees that have timber value or another economic value that you're interested in. You go and pick out the specific trees, and I've sort of marked some supposed crop trees with C, and then you take away the competing trees around them so that the tree has open space on at least 3 sides to grow. So that's one way of approaching silvopasture. So that gives you a nice evenly scattered stand, and you've selected all your good trees. And that's really nice, but there's a couple of downsides. One is it's a little harder to do that logging and avoid any kind of damage to the residual trees. All those trees that had trees around them now don't, and so they're more vulnerable to wind throw. So another way you could do it is you could do different versions of patch tree thinning. Here I've done the patch tree thinning in rows just to give you that row access. It's easier for logging. You can drop them all into the rows. It's easier to get those trees out. So if you don't have specific high quality trees that are scattered throughout the site, you might want to think about an approach like this. Sometimes your crop trees might not be evenly scattered about the site, and you might wind up with crop tree thinning that actually gives you sort of patches anyway. So just finally, a couple of other things to think about. As I said, I think if you're thinning, you want to aim for about 30 to 50% canopy cover. That's sort of the sweet spot in between there in terms of having enough shade for your livestock to have the welfare of the shade, but enough sunlight so that especially your cool season grasses will do quite well. If you start getting over 50% canopy, you're really going to reduce the growth of your grasses. And then, as I say, When you thin, you might lose more due to wind throw or breakage because those trees are vulnerable when they're first thinned. But on the other hand, the tree canopies will fill out. So if you're doing the thinning yourself, you can afford to go slowly. If you're having a logger come in, I would say thin it to below 50% cover because they're only going to come in once, and you can't get them to come back and drop 3 or 4 more trees. Really important to conduct the thinning when the ground can take the operation. So when it's frozen or when the soils are really dry, because otherwise you can get really bad rotting and really mess up your soils. And if you have oaks, I don't know up here if you have oak wilt, but just in general, avoid logging those areas between April and the middle of July because the danger of disease transmission is much higher if you log then when the insects are present. You have to have a plan for the slash when you thin. I would say leave it on site. You can chip it. You can just put it in rows. It's going to temporarily be space where you don't have your forage growing, but it also has valuable nutrients in it for the soil. What to plant? We don't have good research up here. On my site, I planted a mix, and what did best was the orchard grass, and after that, the meadow fescue. And I didn't thin my site well enough. So I think if you thin aggressively, you can probably have more species do well. But I would say, kind of like what Gabe Brown was saying, if you plant a mix, then you have a good chance that something will do okay. Orchard grass definitely tolerates shade pretty well, but as you all know, if you let it go too long, it doesn't have the highest forage quality. Definitely trees drop branches on fence, and so you really do have to walk your fences, watch, especially if it's just a poly wire, look for that. There's a tool that the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems is working on developing called the Fruit and Nut Compass. So if you're interested in establishing silvopasture for fruit or nut production, it's probably still maybe a year out from being ready, but it's a spreadsheet tool that will kind of suggest what the different costs are, what the different possible income streams are to do some of that economic analysis. There's a tool they have just released called the Livestock Compass, which doesn't specifically look at silvopasture, but might be something you might want to play around with just for your livestock operation to just kind of see where your profitability centers are. And right now that is at veggiecompass.com, and it will be moving to a website called compasstoolbox.com. And I think that wraps it up